In the early 9th century, Russia was inhabited by Slavic tribes. In the late 9th century, the Vikings captured Novgorod and then forged the tribes into a nation centered on Kiev. The new nation was called Rus, and in time its Viking rulers adopted the native customs and language of Russian society. The nation became known as Kievan Rus, which would become a powerful empire in the Middle Ages. It served as the foundation and beginning of both Russia and the Ukraine. It traded with the Byzantine Empire, which formed when the Roman Empire split into two separate empires. The Eastern Roman Empire became known as the Byzantine Empire. This empire continued on for 1,000 years after the Western Roman Empire, including Rome, collapsed in 476 CE. The Byzantine Empire ruled most of Eastern and Southern Europe throughout the Middle Ages. Its capital city, Constantinople, was the largest and wealthiest city in Europe during the Middle Ages, and did a lot of trading with Russia. The Russians exported slaves, honey, and furs. However, after the ruler, known as Yaroslav the Wise, died in 1054, Kievan Rus broke up into a federation of princedoms, which were areas ruled by a prince. Furthermore, the economic importance of Kievan Rus declined. From the 12th century, the centre of Europe trade shifted to Germany and Italy. Meanwhile, in 988, Prince Vladimir converted to Greek Orthodox Christianity, with his people following him soon after. By 1169, Kiev was captured by Andrew Boleslavsky, a prince from the northeast. However, he was assassinated and the Russian princes continued to quarrel among themselves. By the mid-13th century, the Mongols stormed into Eastern Europe and soon invaded Russia. They captured and destroyed Ryazan, Moscow, and then the prince, Vladimir. The Mongols, also known as the Tatar, then marched towards Novgorod, but they were slowed by the thaw in the spring of 1238. Soon, they turned to the south. In 1240, they destroyed Kiev, and their leader, Batu Khan, established himself as ruler of a large part of Eastern Europe, including Russia. His realm was called the Golden Horde. Its capital was Sarai. The Mongol Tatar at first destroyed towns and villages and massacred the inhabitants, but afterwards let the Russian princes of their states run themselves. Although they were forced to pay tribute to the Mongol Tatars and supply soldiers for their armies. But the Mongol Tatars did not invade the prince-run state of Novgorod. The ruler Alexander Nevsky voluntarily accepted Mongol rule. In that same year, Alexander's army defeated the Swedes, and then in 1242 he crushed the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of the Ice.
Ice, ice, baby. Ice, ice, baby.
By 1263, his son Daniel became Prince of Moscow. Daniel conquered large amounts of surrounding territory before his death in 1303. His policy of annexing territory was continued by his successors. Moscow gradually became more and more important. In the mid-1300s, the Lithuanians attacked Moscow but failed to capture it. Then in 1380, Prince Dmitry defeated the Mongol Tatars, but retaliated by capturing Moscow and burned it to the ground.
I said, oh Lord Jesus, it's a fire.
In 1438, the Greek Orthodox Church temporarily united with the Catholic Church. The Russians were very offended.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
The union was rejected in Russia, and by 1449, the Russian Church split from the Greek Orthodox Church.
Nothing's fine, I'm torn. I'm all out of faith. This is how I feel. I'm cold and I am shaking.
In the years to come, the Mongol Tatar dominance in Russia was finally extinguished in 1480, and soon the Golden Horde had broken up. At that time, Russia was ruled by Ivan III. He greatly increased the territory of Russia, conquering Novgorod, and eventually he became ruler of most of the Russian people. The last independent parts of Russia were taken by his son, Vasily III. In the 16th century, Russia had far more contact with Western Europe. Many European craftsmen came to work in Russia. By that time, Ivan IV, also known as Ivan the Terrible, inherited the throne of Russia.
You're terrible, Muriel.
However, at that time he was only 3 years old and did not obtain the power until 1547. He was crowned Tsar, which is like a president, and then expanded Russian territory. By 1553, the English reached northwest Russia by sea and began trading.
Fresh in the drink, Governor!
In 1563, the first printing press was introduced into Russia. But in 1571, the Crimean Khan Tatar captured and burned Moscow.
The building is on fire. I said, no, what?
But the next year, they were defeated by the Russians. Ivan then turned into a degenerated tyrant. In 1565, he formed a private army called the Oprishnia. They were completely loyal to him and they killed anyone suspected of being the Tsar's enemy. In 1570, the Oprishniks sacked Novgorod because Ivan believed the Novgorodians were collaborating with his enemies and the Polish. The Oprishniks massacred the inhabitants, killing thousands. And by 1582, Ivan conquered the Khanate of Siberia, which gave its name to Siberia. However, the people of Moscow denounced Ivan's cruelty, and as a result, he was strangled. Ivan even killed his own son and heir by hitting him with an iron-tipped staff. Ivan finally died in 1584. Ivan's other son, Theodore, then became ruler, but he was very weak. He died in 1598 without leaving an heir. Before he died, he turned the peasants into serfs, which were agricultural labourers, by removing their right to leave their lords or masters, basically putting them into slavery. By the turn of the 17th century, Theodore's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, was persuaded to take the throne of Russia. Unfortunately, Russia suffered from a famine in the early 1600s, and it just got worse from there. In 1603, a man turned up in Poland, claiming to be Ivan the Terrible's youngest son, Dmitry.
Yeah!
In reality, Dmitry had his throat cut in 1591. However, the pretender, known as False Dmitry, raised an army of Polish and rebel Russians and advanced on Moscow in 1605. Boris conveniently died and Dmitry captured Moscow, where he became the Tsar. However, his reign was short-lived. He was replaced by Prince Vasily Shalsky in 1606. Russia then descended into an anarchy. There were several uprisings and order was not restored until 1613, when a man named Michael Romanov was made the Tsar of Russia. By 1645, he was succeeded by his son Alexis, known as Most Gentle. During his reign, the Ukrainians, who were ruled by the Polish, sought protection from Russia, and by the mid-1600s they formed a union with Russia. The Polish then went to war against Russia, but they were defeated. In the late 17th century, Russian settlers moved into Siberia and the Bering Straits, connecting the Pacific and Arctic Oceans between Russia and Alaska. Meanwhile, Alexis also made a new code of laws. The peasants lost a lot of their freedom. However, Stefan Razin led a rebellion against the Russian landlords, but his rebellion was crushed and he was executed. The Russians then made a deal with China and they worked out how to separate their borders. The 17th century Russia was also torn by schism, a divide between the people of religious denomination. Patriarch Nikon decided to update books used by the Russian Church by making sure they were correctly translated from the Greek originals. He hoped to remove any mistakes that had crept in over the years. He also made some changes to the church rites. However, some Russians refused to accept these changes. They were called Old Believers, and they were persecuted. Alexis was followed by his son Theodore III, who in turn was followed by Peter the Great. However, it looked at first as if Theodore's 15-year-old brother Ivan might claim the throne, but he had low intelligence.
I am too smart! I am too smart! S-M-R-T! I mean S-M-A-R-T!
So the Patriarch called a meeting of powerful Russians and they proclaimed Ivan's half-brother, Peter, the Tsar, even though he was only 9 years old. However, shortly afterwards, Ivan's sister, Sophia, staged a coup.
I want one! Give it to me now!
Since both boys were underage, Sophia was appointed head of state, but she plotted to siege the throne.
Who says I can't?
Peter's supporters staged a coup and then sent her to a convent. Peter's mother was then made head of state. But Peter did not gain power of Russia until 1694. When he did, he was determined to bring Russia up to date. In 1696 and 97, he travelled to the west. While he was away, Sophia's supporters staged a rebellion, but the rebellion was crushed. When Peter returned, he executed over 1,000 of Sophia's supporters. He went on to build a navy in 1696, and he captured land from the Turks. Peter also encouraged foreign trade, building factories, and translation of foreign books into Russian. Peter also introduced the Julian calendar, originally introduced by Julius Caesar and the calendars we use today.
What year is it?
And he reformed Russian government and administration. Peter also introduced Western dress, and he banned the Russian nobles from having beards.
Nice wig, Janice. What's it made of?
Your mom's chest hair.
When the patriarch died in 1700, Peter refused to replace him. Instead, he formed a body called a Holy Synod to head the Russian Orthodox Church. The church was made a lower rank to the Tsar and was meant to serve him. Peter also founded a port in northwest Russia called St. Petersburg. This new city was built in between 1703 and 1712. It was compulsory that the vast numbers of peasants were to do the work, and many thousands of them died because of the harsh conditions. Peter also imposed heavy taxation on his people. The 1700s saw Peter the Great go to war with Sweden in what became known as the Great Northern War, with Poland and Denmark as his allies. The Russians were defeated and the Swedes invaded Ukraine but were crushed in battle. However, Peter was less successful against the Turks. In 1710 he went to war with them, but in 1711 his army were defeated and he was forced to make peace. By the 1720s, the Russians and Swedes also made peace. Russia then gained Estonia, Latvia and the land around the Gulf of Finland, and Peter prevailed in the war against Persia, but he died in 1725, and he had done a lot for Russia. The 1700s also saw a lot of Russian rulers. Now I hope you're ready for this. Peter was succeeded by Catherine I, followed by Peter II. Then in 1730, Anna became the Empress of Russia. When she died in 1740, a small child named Ivan VI became Tsar, but he died in 1741. Empress Elizabeth replaced him and she seized the throne with the help of the palace guards. She ruled until her death in 1762. During her reign, Russia fought a successful war with the Turks, and in the years of 1736 and 39, Russia regained land lost to them previously. Meanwhile, Russia's first university was founded in Moscow in 1755, and by 1762, Peter III became Tsar, but he reigned for only a few months. Supporters of his wife Catherine assassinated him in 1762, with herself gaining the throne. She became known as Catherine the Great. In 1773, a man named Emelian Pugachev led a rebellion against Catherine the Great. And although it was reasonably successful, it was finally crushed in 1774. Pugachev was brought to Moscow in an iron cage and presented to Catherine. He was then beheaded and his body was cut into quarters. Afterwards, Catherine reformed the local government. Meanwhile, Russia continued to expand in the 18th century. As a result, the Russians gained land by the Black Sea and took the peninsula of Crimea. The Turks lost more territory after the war in 1791, known as just one of many Russo-Turkish wars. Soon, Russia and Prussia, which is made up with parts of several of today's countries, and Austria helped themselves to a slice of Polish territory, with each country having a piece of Poland. Russia's territory and population greatly increased. Russia's new territory in the south was called New Russia, and many people migrated there, with plenty more settling in the east. By the time Catherine the Great died in 1796, Russia was very powerful. Catherine was succeeded by her son Paul I, who passed a law that in future the eldest son should inherit the throne of Russia.
I was elected to lead, not to read.
He joined the war against France in 1798, but withdrew in the 1800s. Paul was then assassinated in 1801. Paul, however, was followed by son Alexander I, who reformed the government, created new schools, and established 5 universities in Russia. By 1805, Alexander joined the fight against Napoleon and the French army, but the Russians were defeated at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1807. But soon battles were fought with Sweden and Alexander captured Finland. He agreed to rule Finland as a Grand Duke, not as the Tsar. The Finns were allowed to have their own assembly, similar to a parliament. By 1812, another war with France began. This time, Napoleon invaded Russia with a vast army. The Russians retreated, although they made a stand at the Battle of Borodino in September. The Russians, however, had a plan. Russian troops managed to keep ahead of the French. They would evacuate and then burn the towns and villages along the way, weakening the French army, who relied on these places to resupply. In October 1812, the French captured Moscow, but it was burnt down by the Russians.
Then I thought somebody was barbecuing.
In November, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat his army back to France. Along the way, a lot of them died of starvation and also in the bitter Russian winter weather. Disease also spread through the French army. Soon, it was Prussia and Austria's turn and joined the struggle against Napoleon. Alexander died in 1825, and after his death, a rebellion took place. Some Russian officers were influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution, and they formed a secret society. The Decembrists, as they were called, attempted a coup. They gathered in Senate Square in the capital, but troops loyal to the Tsar opened fire. Afterwards, 5 rebels were hanged in the main square. Nevertheless, the attempted uprising was a foretaste of things to come in Russia. Following these events in 1825, the new Tsar, Nicholas I, was determined to stamp out revolutionary movements. He formed a police force to detect revolutionaries. In 1830, Poland, which was ruled by Russia, rose to rebellion, and eventually it was crushed. Furthermore, in 1849, the Tsar got involved in the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and crushed the Hungarian uprising. By 1853, the Crimean War came into light, and already during the 19th century, the Turkish Empire, which included the Balkans, was declining. The Russian Tsar was keen to take advantage of the decline of Turkey. However, the British were alarmed as they feared that if Russia expanded into southern Asia, they might threaten the British hold on India. The French became involved because of an argument over who should control the holy places, which is modern-day Israel. It became a battle between the French Catholics and the Orthodox Christians. The French ruler, Napoleon III, was keen to fight a successful war and use the situation as he believed the French people would now get behind him. In 1853, the Russians occupied what is now Romania, which was part of the Turkish Empire. Furthermore, the Russian Navy sank several Turkish ships in the Black Sea. Turkey declared war on Russia that same year. By 1854, Britain and France both went to war with Russia. The war became known as the Crimean War, because most of the fighting took place on their peninsula. The Russians were soon forced to withdraw from what is now Romania. However, Napoleon III persuaded the British to help him to try and capture the Russian fort of Sevastopol, arguing that it was a threat to the security of the whole region, and during battle, the Tsar died. In 1855, the Allies successfully captured Sevastopol. By March 1856, the new Tsar, Alexander II, made peace by the Treaty of Paris. Alexander II was a reforming Tsar. His great achievement was to abolish serfdom in 1861, freeing those agricultural labourers. The peasants received some land from the landowners. However, the landowners were compensated for their loss and the peasants were made to pay in instalments, which burdened them with heavy payments for many years. In 1864, Alexander II set up new forms and councils. However, this did not prevent the revolutionary movements growing stronger. Circassia was a small independent nation on the northeastern shore of the Black Sea. For no reason other than ethnic hatred, and over a course of hundreds of raids, the Russians drove the Circassians from their homeland and deported them to the Ottoman Empire. At least 600,000 people lost their lives to massacre, starvation, and the elements, while hundreds of thousands more were forced to leave their homeland. By 1864, 3/4 of the population was annihilated, and the Circassians had become one of the first stateless peoples in modern history. Rebel groups soon made attempts to assassinate the Tsar Alexander II in 1866 and 67, with failed attempts. 1879 saw the imperial train derailed in yet another attempt to kill him, which was unsuccessful. Alexander II was finally assassinated in March 1881, when a man threw a grenade at him. Alexander II was replaced by Alexander III. Revolutionary movements continued to grow during his reign. Meanwhile, at the end of the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution reached Russia. In the 1880s, Russia was still an agricultural society. It was backward compared to many European countries. However, from about 1890, Russia began to change rapidly into an industrial country. They started building the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would finally be completed in 1905. Alexander III was succeeded by Nicholas II. He was a weak ruler who led Russia into a disastrous war with Japan. In the late 19th century, Russia increased its influence in the Pacific region. However, Japan was a rising power in the area. In 1898, Russia leased bases in Manchuria. Other powers demanded that Russia leave but ignored their wishes. Finally, in 1904, the Japanese attacked the Russian base at Port Arthur. The Japanese won victories on the land and at sea. Port Arthur surrendered in January 1905. In the next few months, the Japanese won plenty of battles against the Russians, who were forced to sign a peace treaty at Portsmouth. 1905 also saw the revolution in Russia begin, with protesters wanting higher pay and a 10-hour working day. They marched through St. Petersburg to the Winter Palace. However, the palace guard opened fire, killing hundreds of people. This time was known as Bloody Sunday. Following this, there were riots by peasants, and Russia was hit with a wave of strikes. There were also mutinies in the army and also navy. Finally, by October, Russia was paralysed by a general strike. Nicholas II was forced to give in and agreed to form a representative assembly called Duma. However, Nicholas had no intention of giving up his position as sole ruler. 4 Dumas were held, but each one had less power than the last. One ominous occurrence was the rise of Marxism in Russia. Karl Marx is considered the father of communism. Marx was a German philosopher and economist who wrote about his ideas in a book called The Communist Manifesto in 1848. His communist theories have become known as Marxism. A Marxist party was formed in Russia in 1889. A meeting in 1903 was to split into 2 groups: the Bolsheviks, which comes from a Russian word for majority, and the Mensheviks, which is from the word for minority. Then in 1914, World War I would begin. World War I was fought between the Allied powers and the Central Powers. The main members of the Allied powers were France, Russia, and Britain. The United States also fought on the side of the Allies after 1917. The main members of the Central Powers were Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, and Bulgaria. Although there were a number of causes for the war, the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the main catalyst for starting the war. He was assassinated by a Serbian while visiting Sarajevo. After the assassination, Austria declared war on Serbia. Then, Russia prepared to defend its ally, which was Serbia. Next, Germany declared war on Russia to protect Austria. This then caused France to declare war on Germany to protect its ally, which was Russia. Germany invaded Belgium to get to France, which caused Britain to declare war on Germany. This all happened within a few days. In September 1914, the Russian army was severely defeated at Tannenberg. Before the battle, the Russian army was invading eastern Germany with some success. The Second Army was attacking to the southeast while the First Army attacked to the north. The plan was to encircle and destroy the German 8th Army. However, the First Army, under the command of General Rennenkampf, decided to pause for a few days. This left the Second Army exposed. The Germans decided to take all their soldiers and attack the Russian Second Army. This left them very exposed to an attack from the north, but they decided to take that risk. They used trains to transport troops very quickly around the region. The Germans concentrated all their forces in one area and attacked the Russian Second Army on the left flank. The Germans soundly defeated the Russians, and soon the Russian Second Army was in retreat. The Germans pursued the Russian Second Army and completely destroyed it. Out of the 206,000 Russian soldiers, around 50,000 were killed or wounded. Another 100,000 were taken prisoner. After defeating the Second Army, the Germans turned to the Russian First Army and were able to drive them from the German lands. Although the Russian army was not completely defeated, they never entered German lands again in World War I. Russia never really recovered. In March 1915, the Tsar took command of the Russian army. Russia continued to suffer terrible losses and the country bled to death. Soon, the country suffered severe shortages on the home front. In 1917, a shortage of bread in St. Petersburg led to riots within workers going on strike. When the Tsar Nicholas II ordered the army to suppress the riot, the soldiers in the city joined the rioters. The Tsarist regime quickly collapsed and Nicholas II had to give up his throne. A provisional government made up the deputies from the Duma then ruled Russia. A moderate socialist named Alexander Kerensky became Prime Minister. The government was run by two political parties: the Petrograd Soviet, representing the workers and the soldiers, and the Provisional Government, which was the traditional government without the Tsar. Over the next several months, the two sides ruled Russia. One of the main factions of the Petrograd Soviet was the group the Bolsheviks. They were led by Vladimir Lenin and believed that the new Russian government should be a Marxist, which was a communist government. In October 1917, Lenin took full control of the government and what is called the Bolshevik Revolution. Russia was now the first communist country in the world. After the revolution, Russia exited World War I by signing a treaty with Germany. The new government took control of all industry and moved the Russian economy from a rural one to an industrial one. It also seized farmland from landholders and distributed it among the peasants. Women were given equal rights to those of men, and religion was banned from many aspects of society.
I don't even believe in Jesus!
From 1918, Russia experienced a civil war between the Bolsheviks, also called the Red Army, and the anti-Bolsheviks, which was known as the White Army. The Bolsheviks won and the new country was called the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republic.
Back in the USSR!
During the Civil War, the communists simply took food from the peasants by force whenever they needed it. The harsh policies of the communists provoked unrest. In 1921, there were strikes at naval bases, which was crushed by force. However, Vladimir Lenin then made a strategic retreat. He announced his new economic policy. The peasants were allowed to grow food and sell it for profit. The communists only retained control of the commanding heights of industry, which were the most important ones. The new economic policy helped Russia to recover from the devastation wreaked by civil war. However, time was running out for Lenin. In 1922, he suffered the first of a series of strokes and he died by 1924. Following Lenin's death, the cunning and devious Joseph Stalin took power. Stalin had been the General Secretary of the Communist Party since 1922. After Lenin's death, Stalin took over as sole leader of the Soviet Union. By 1928, he had made himself a dictator. Stalin was one of the most brutal leaders in world history. He had anyone that didn't agree with him killed. He also caused famines in areas of the country so people he wanted dead would starve. Throughout his rule, he would order purges where millions of people he thought were against him would be killed or put into slave labour camps. Historians aren't sure about how many people he killed, but they estimate between 20 to 40 million people. Between 1937 and 38, Stalin purged the officers in the Red Army. About 80% of the generals and 50% of the colonels were executed. So the Red Army was weakened just when Russia was facing a threat from Nazi Germany. Furthermore, in the 1930s, under Stalin, the churches were persecuted. Despite Stalin's terrible crimes, Russian industry grew rapidly in the years between 1929 and 1941. In 1939, Stalin made a non-aggression pact with Nazi leader Adolf Hitler. In that same year, Germany invaded Poland. Great Britain and France responded by declaring war on Germany, and soon World War II had begun. A lot of events throughout the world led to the beginning of World War II. In many ways, World War II was a direct result of the turmoil left behind by World War I. The Treaty of Versailles ended World War I between Germany and the Allied powers. Because Germany had lost the war, the treaty was very harsh against Germany. They were forced to accept the responsibility of the war damages suffered by the Allies. The treaty required Germany to pay a huge sum of money called reparations. The problem with the treaty is that it left the German economy in ruins. People were starving and the government was in chaos. In the period before World War II, Japan was growing rapidly. However, as an island nation, they did not have the land or the natural resources to sustain their growth. Japan began to look to grow their empire in order to gain new resources. They invaded Manchuria in 1931 and China in 1937. When the economic turmoil left behind by World War I, some cities were taken over by dictators who formed powerful fascist governments. The first fascist government was Spain, which was ruled by dictator Franco. Then Mussolini took control of Italy, and these dictators wanted to expand their empires and begin to look for new lands to conquer. Italy invaded and took over Ethiopia in 1935. Adolf Hitler looked up to Mussolini and decided to use his plans to take over Germany. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power. The Germans were desperate for someone to turn around their economy and restore their national pride. Hitler offered them hope. In 1934, Hitler was proclaimed the leader and became the dictator of Germany. While talking about peace, Hitler began to rearm Germany. He allied Germany with Mussolini and Italy. Then, Hitler looked to restore Germany to power by expanding his empire. He first took over Austria in 1938, and when the League of Nations did nothing to stop him, Hitler became bolder and took over Czechoslovakia in 1939, which is modern-day Czech Republic and Slovakia. After World War I, the nations of Europe were wary and did not want another war. When countries such as Italy and Germany became aggressive and began to take over their neighbours and build up their armies, countries such as Britain and France hoped to keep the peace and through appeasement. This meant that they tried to make Germany and Hitler happy rather than try to stop him. They had hoped by meeting his demands he would be satisfied and there wouldn't be any war. Unfortunately, the policy of appeasement backfired. It only made Hitler bolder. It also gave him time to build up his army. The period before World War II was also a time of the great economic suffering, which would last throughout the world, called the Great Depression. Many people were out of work and struggling to survive. This created unstable governments and worldwide turmoil that helped lead to World War II. World War II was fought between the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, and Japan, against the Allied powers, Britain, United States, Soviet Union, and France. Most of the countries in the world were involved in some way. It was the deadliest war in all of human history, with around 70 million people killed. While Nazi Germany invaded Poland, Stalin demanded that Finland give up territory to him, which he hoped would make Russia easier to defend. When the Finns refused, Stalin went to war. The Russians attacked Finland in November 1939. At first, the Finns were successful and resisted, but superior Russian members eventually overwhelmed them. The Finns surrendered in 1940. In this same year, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were still independent. However, by that summer, the Red Army entered and they were absorbed into the Soviet Union. But despite the non-aggression pact made in 1939 with the Germans, they invaded Russia in 1941. Stalin was taken by surprise, and the Russians suffered a very heavy loss. Finland, Romania, and Hungary assisted the Germans. However, the Russians obtained substantial material and aid from Britain and the USA. At first, the Germans advanced rapidly and captured a huge number of Russians. Most of the captives did not survive the war. However, the rate of German advance slowed, and by the beginning of December, it had run out of steam. The Germans failed to take Moscow, and on December 5, 1941, the Russians counterattacked. They made some progress in early 1942, but in the summer, the Germans returned to the offensive. German troops then advanced into the Caucasus. Others attempted to capture Stalingrad. The battle for the city was fought from August onward. By November, the Russians counterattacked and encircled the Germans. The majority of German troops surrendered on the 31st of January, 1943. The rest surrendered by the 2nd of February. Meanwhile, the Germans withdrew from Caucasus. The Germans and Russians fought a great tank battle at Kursk in July 1943. The result was a resounding Russian victory. Afterwards, the Red Army advanced rapidly. In that same year, they liberated Kiev. By the time of 1944, the Red Army entered the Baltic states. In June, they began a massive offensive in Central Europe. Romania surrendered on the 23rd of August, and although Bulgaria was not officially at war with Russia, she helped the Germans. So in September, Russia declared war and occupied Bulgaria. Finland surrendered in September, and by January 1945, the Russians advanced across Poland. By April, they entered Berlin. The Battle of Berlin was primarily fought between the German army and the Soviet army. The Soviet army vastly outnumbered the Germans. The Soviets had over 2,500,000 soldiers, 7,500 aircraft, and 6,250 tanks. The Germans had around 1 million soldiers, 2,200 aircraft, and around 1,500 tanks. What was left of the German army was ill-equipped for the battle. Many of the German soldiers were sick, wounded, or starving. Desperate for soldiers, the German army included young boys and old men. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16th when the Soviets attacked along the Oder River, near Berlin. They quickly defeated the German forces outside Berlin and advanced on the city. By the 20th of April, the Soviets began bombing Berlin. They worked their way around the city and had it completely surrounded in a few days. At this point, Hitler began to realise that he was going to lose the battle. He desperately tried to move the German army from Western Germany to Berlin in order to save the city. Once the Soviets entered the city, the fighting became fierce. With the city in ruins and the streets full of rubble, tanks were of little use and much of the fighting was hand-to-hand and building-to-building. By April 30th, the Soviets were approaching the centre of the city and the Germans were running out of ammunition. At this point, Hitler admitted defeat and committed suicide along with his new wife, Eva Braun. On the night of May 1st, most of the remaining German soldiers attempted to break out of the city and escape to the Western Front. Few of them made it out. The next day, the German generals inside Berlin surrendered to the Soviet army. Only a few days later, on May 8, 1945, the remaining leaders of Nazi Germany signed an unconditional surrender to the Allies and the war in Europe was over. The Battle of Berlin resulted in the surrender of the German army and the death of Adolf Hitler. It was a resounding victory for the Soviet Union and the Allies. The battle took its toll on both sides, however. Around 81,000 Soviet Union soldiers were killed and another 280,000 were wounded. Around 92,000 German soldiers were killed, with another 220,000 wounded. The city of Berlin was reduced to rubble and around 22,000 German civilians were killed. The Great Patriotic War, as it was called in Russia, caused terrible suffering to the Russian people. When Germany surrendered, the Red Army was left occupying Eastern Europe, so Stalin installed puppet regimes in each country. After World War II, the country of Germany ended up dividing into two separate countries. East Germany became a communist country under the control of the Soviet Union. At the same time, West Germany was a democratic country and allied with Britain, France, and the United States. The initial plan was that the country would eventually be reunited, but this didn't happen for a very long time. The Cold War began not too long after World War II ended in 1945. Although the Soviet Union was an important member of the Allied powers, there was great distrust between the Soviet Union and the rest of the Allies. The Allies were concerned with the brutal leadership of Joseph Stalin as well as the spread of communism. After Stalin died, life in Russia relaxed a little. However, Russia was still ruled by a regime. Religious believers were still persecuted, so were intellectuals who disagreed with communism. At first, it was not clear who would succeed Stalin. However, by 1956, Nikita Khrushchev had emerged as the new ruler of Russia. His rulings would be the beginning of economic progress. By the late 1950s, the diet of the Russian people was much better than it was in the early 20th century, but the Cold War continued. The Cold War was often fought between the superpowers of the United States and the Soviet Union in something called a proxy war. These were wars fought between other countries, but with each side getting support from the different superpower. Examples of a proxy wars include the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Soviet-Afghanistan War. The United States and the Soviet Union also tried to fight the Cold War by demonstrating their power and technology. One example of this was the arms race, where each side tried to have the best weapons and the most nuclear bombs. The idea was that a large stockpile of weapons would deter the other from ever attacking. Another example was the space race, where each side tried to show that it had better scientists and technology by accomplishing certain space missions first. In 1957, Russia launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, and sent the first man into space. As people in East Germany began to realize that they did not want to live under the rule of the Soviet Union and communism, they started to leave the eastern part of the country and move into the west. Finally, the Soviets and the East German leaders had had enough. On August 12th and 13th of 1961, they built a wall around Berlin to prevent people from leaving. At first, the wall was just a barbed wire fence. Later, it would be rebuilt with concrete blocks 12 feet high and 4 feet wide. There was also a time called the Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in 1962, when the Soviet Union began to install nuclear missiles in Cuba. This is perhaps the closest that the United States and the Soviet Union came to nuclear war in the Cold War. The United States had installed several nuclear missile sites in Turkey and Italy, with the range to strike Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. As a result, the Soviet Union felt they needed missile sites that could strike at the United States. At the same time, the Cuban government wanted protection from the United States. So they decided to work together and have Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba that could strike almost any portion of the USA. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba captured pictures of long Soviet missiles. This was a crisis like never before. These missiles could reach any point of the United States, with nuclear warheads causing mass destruction. President Kennedy called a meeting with his main security advisors. They considered a number of options from diplomacy to a full-scale attack and invasion on Cuba. The Joint Chiefs of Staff voted to invade. They felt this was the only viable option. However, President Kennedy was concerned that this would start World War III between the US and the Soviet Union. He opted to set up a naval blockade. Kennedy announced this plan on October 22, 1962. He showed the world the missile bases and said that the United States would be putting Cuba under quarantine. This meant that no offensive weapons would be allowed to enter Cuba. He also said that any attack on the US from Cuba would be considered an attack of war from the Soviet Union. Over the next several days, the crisis became more intense. The Soviet Union said that they would not back down, and by the 24th, President Kennedy believed the US would have to invade Cuba. Although the Soviet Union was publicly saying that it would never back down, they were secretly negotiating with the United States. Eventually, the two sides reached an agreement. The the Soviet Union would remove missiles from Cuba as long as the United States agreed to never invade Cuba again. In secret, the US also had to agree to remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey and Italy. Finally, the crisis was over. Russia was then dragged into a long and destructive war against Afghanistan. By the 1970s, Soviet economic growth slowed, and by 1980 it had halted altogether. This was signs and the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union. Eventually, Mikhail Gorbachev was elected General Secretary of the Soviet Union in 1985. When he took over the Soviet Union, the economy was in bad shape. In 1986, an explosion occurred at the nuclear power plant at Chernobyl in Ukraine. The resulting radiation was disastrous for the Soviet economy, which was already struggling. Gorbachev had ideas to reform the economy and modernize the political situation in the country. There were two main platforms of Gorbachev's reform. The first he called Glasnost. Glasnost allowed more freedom of speech and openness in the government. Although Glasnost was a good thing for the people, it also allowed people to protest and the media to report issues for the first time. Many of the outlying states used this newfound freedom to express their desire for independence. The other major reform was called Perestroika. Perestroika means restructuring. Gorbachev meant to restructure the Soviet economy to work more efficiently. He allowed some private ownership and released some of the tight control the government had on the economy. However, the people and the economy of the Soviet Union were used to the government doing everything. Things got worse before they got better. In 1989, events then began to move rapidly. Firstly, the Russian army withdrew from Afghanistan and nationalism grew, especially in the Baltic states, and communism began to collapse in Eastern Europe. Russia were then losing their hold on East Germany. Then the announcement was made. The borders were open and people could freely move between Eastern and Western Germany. Much of the wall was torn down by the people chipping away as they celebrated the end to the divide in Germany. With the newfound freedom of Gorbachev's reforms, some outlying Soviet states began to rebel. The first states to demand their freedom were the Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. Some more states also wanted their independence, including Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia. The central government of the Soviet Union began to feel the pressure of so many states wanting independence. On October 3, 1990, Germany was officially reunified into a single country. With the communist government on the verge of collapse, the Soviet hardliners decided to take action. In August 1991, they kidnapped Gorbachev and announced it to the world that he was too sick to govern. They would be taking over. When the Soviet citizens began to protest, the hardliners called in the military to shut them down. However, the soldiers refused to shoot and arrest their own people. Without the military to back them, the takeover had failed. On Christmas Eve in 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved. Gorbachev then resigned on Christmas Day in that same year. The Soviet Union was divided up into 15 separate independent countries. The collapse of communism meant a period of hardship for the Russian people. During the 1990s, there was a painful transition to capitalism, with Boris Yeltsin becoming the president of the newly formed Russia. In the early 2000s, something big would come out of Russia regarding the music industry, and this would be the singing duo of Tatu. Tatu consisted of Julia Volkova and Lena Katina. Following the split with Universal Music Russia, the duo was signed to their own production company, TA Music. The duo established their success with their debut single, All the Things She Said. Which gained acclaim from music journalists and critics. The video of the single, however, generated controversy worldwide, showing the girls kissing in the rain in school uniforms. This took the world by storm, with their website constantly crashing due to high numbers of viewings catching a glimpse of the All the Things She Said video clip. Along with the #1 single, the following songs, All About Us, and Not Gonna Get Us gained success and also charted at number 1 on other contemporary music charts. Due to their success, the duo are recognised as one of the most successful female acts to emerge in the early decade and have established themselves as the most successful Russian act to date. Tatu represented Russia in the 2003 Eurovision Song Contest, finishing 3rd place. By 2011, the duo officially announced their separation due to personal reasons and conflicts between them and embarked on solo careers, which started around the end of 2008. As of 2015, Tatu have sold over 35 million records and listing among some of the best-selling albums by a girl group. They reunited in late December 2012 for a concert and announced their comeback after their performance in the opening ceremony of the Olympics in Sochi 2014. With Russia hosting the Winter Olympics, it ended up causing huge controversy regarding the amount the Games would cost, its location, and human rights laws. The Circassia organisation spoke out against the Olympics, arguing that the Games would take place on land that had been inhabited by their ancestors in recorded history until 1864, when the resolution of the Russian Circassia War was stated to have caused the disappearance of between 90 and 94% of the Circassia nation. They demanded that the Olympics be cancelled or moved unless Russia apologised. The Games were viewed as offensive because they would include the date of the 150th anniversary of what the Circassians called the genocide. The rights of the LGBT, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people in Russia were a concern leading up to the Games. Russia became the subject of international criticism following the signing of a federal law by leader Vladimir Putin in June 2013, which banned the distribution of material in favour of non-traditional sexual relationships. The Human Rights Campaign president argued that even kissing a same-sex partner or displaying LGBT symbols such as the rainbow flag could be illegal under this law. The legislation was also attributed to an increase in homophobic violence in Russia by anti-gay and neo-Nazi groups. Russia spent more than $51 billion on the Sochi Olympics, topping China, who had a $40 billion budget for the 2008 Summer Olympics, which had more than 3 times the number of events. China had 302 events, with an average cost of $132 million per event. But Russia only had 98 events, costing an average $520 million per event. With event judging controversy in some events, terrorist threats, money spending, dodgy dealing and tax increases, plus many more other things, this would become one of the most controversial games in history. Another huge event that saw Russians' involvement was the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17. The flight was a scheduled international passenger flight from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur that crashed on the 17th of July 2014 after being shot down, killing all 283 passengers and 15 crew on board. According to the American and German intelligence sources, the plane was mistakenly shot down by pro-Russian insurgents, using a surface-to-air missile fired from the territory which they controlled. On October 13, 2015, the Dutch Safety Board released the final report on their investigation into the incident, concluding the airliner was downed by a surface-to-air missile, which was launched from eastern Ukraine. This event would devastate and shock people around the world. Russia's history goes so much deeper than this, and this is only touching the surface. Today, Russia is still trying to find its feet in the modern world. The world's largest country really does offer it all, from historic cities and idyllic countryside to epic train rides and vodka-fueled nightlife. Russia will be one of those places that you'll never forget, as it will be a trip of a lifetime.